In July 1942, the Nazi regime opened a facility in northeastern Poland that allowed no room for prolonged detention or forced labor. From its design, each element served a specific purpose: reception, processing, and disposal. It was here that hundreds of thousands of people, transported from ghettos across Europe, disappeared in a period of just over a year. Its existence marked one of the most advanced stages of the Third Reich's extermination policy. What kind of personnel directed and executed this daily operation? How was it possible to murder thousands a day without leaving a trace? And why did they destroy everything just before the end? The birth of horror, from labor camp to extermination center. Deep in the Polish forests, about 100 kilometers northeast of Warsaw, a place emerged during World War II that embodies the very essence of the industrialization of evil. Treblinka began as a modest forced labor camp in November 1941, established next to a gravel quarry previously operated by a Polish industrialist. The location was no coincidence. The site already had infrastructure useful for the planned operations: a 6-kilometer railway branch connected to the Małkinia-Sokołów-Podlaski line, which facilitated the transport of both materials and, later, human beings. This logistical element would prove crucial in its evolution into an extermination center. The creation of Treblinka initially responded to the Reich's economic strategy. The system required labor for the extraction of gravel for road construction and for irrigation projects on agricultural land near the Bug River. The prisoners, mainly Jews and Poles, worked in harsh conditions under the command of SS Obersturmführer Theodor van Eupen, a Düsseldorf jurist turned camp administrator. Camp 1E operated with a simple but effective structure: wooden barracks, watchtowers, and a 2-meter-high barbed wire fence. The permanent staff consisted of just 20 German SS officers and around 100 Ukrainian auxiliary guards trained at the Troniki camp. This small contingent was sufficient to maintain an extremely strict disciplinary regime, where any violation was punished with public executions. Few survived more than a few months due to the grueling labor, chronic malnutrition, and unsanitary conditions. Rations consisted of only rationed bread and watery soup. Of the approximately 20,000 prisoners who passed through Treblinka between 1941 and 1944, it is estimated that at least half died in the camp. The turning point would come with the implementation of Operation Reinhard, the plan designed by SS Obergruppenführer Odilo Globokznik to exterminate the Jews of the general government. This operation, conceived in late 1941 and executed between 1942 and 1943, was formally launched after the Wannsee Conference, where the precise mechanisms of the final solution were defined. The decision to use Treblinka as a staging ground for mass extermination was based on specific strategic factors: its remote location, far from major urban centers; its rail connection, which facilitated mass transportation from densely populated ghettos, and prior administrative experience handling prisoners under SS control. In June 1942, construction of Treblinka II began in secret, just a mile and a half from the original labor camp. The premise was radically different. It was no longer about exploiting labor, but rather the systematic elimination of entire populations. The Belzec model was used as a basis, but with significant operational improvements focused on optimizing the flow of victims, increasing the capacity of the gas chambers, and establishing greater efficiency in the disposal of bodies. Construction progressed at a rapid pace, and in less than a month the camp was ready for operation. On July 23, 1942, the first transport arrived from the Warsaw Ghetto, marking the beginning of an industrial process of death that would extend until August 1943. The initial leadership of the camp fell to SS Hauptsturmführer Irmfried Ebel, a doctor from the Action T4 forced euthanasia program. However, his management proved chaotic even by Nazi standards. Bodies piled up without being properly processed, and transports suffered significant delays. Faced with this situation, Globokznik replaced him in September 1942 with Franz Stangl, who had already demonstrated his criminal efficiency as commandant at Sobibor. The transformation of Treblinka represented a fundamental shift in the application of Nazi power. The site ceased to serve any economic purpose. Its sole purpose was immediate physical elimination. By the end of its operational period, an estimated 870,000 people, predominantly Jews, had been murdered there, making it the second deadliest camp of the Holocaust, surpassed only by Auschwitz-Birkenau. Engineering of death, design and operation of Treblinka II. Treblinka II was built as a technical and organizational tool for human extermination. Its perimeter covered approximately 17 hectares, carefully isolated from the surroundings by natural walls formed by densely planted trees and barbed wire fences covered with intertwined branches. This visual isolation served a dual purpose: to avoid outside observation and to prevent the victims from understanding their fate before being led to the gas chambers. The operational structure followed a functional model divided into three main sectors that allowed for a constant, unidirectional flow of victims throughout the extermination process. This spatial distribution reflected the relentless progression from arrival to death, optimizing each phase to maximize the number of people processed while minimizing resources and evidence. The reception area, also known as the lower camp, represented the entry point for trains. One of the most sinister aspects of the design was the meticulous recreation of a conventional railway station, complete with a wooden clock, signs, and a fake ticket booth. This elaborate set was intended to maintain the illusion that the new arrivals had been transferred for labor resettlement, allowing the SS to maintain a measure of order without immediately resorting to open violence. The reception platform was not a permanent structure, but a compacted earth embankment lined with wooden sleepers and rail lines. Its capacity allowed for the simultaneous unloading of between 20 and 40 rail cars, processing between 5,000 and 8,000 people per convoy. This logistical design was designed to avoid bottlenecks in the flow of victims. After disembarking, the first segmentation took place. Men were separated from women and children. Weak, sick, or elderly people were discreetly separated for direct execution in the area known as the lazaret, a space disguised as a medical facility that was actually a firing squad area. The next phase was the disinfection process. Under this sanitary pretext, the victims were ordered to hand over all valuables and strip naked. In separate barracks, identity documents, money, jewelry, watches, clothing, shoes, and even prosthetics and glasses were methodically collected. These belongings were sorted, transported to warehouses, and eventually sent to Germany. This systematic looting process had its own specific accounting within the camp. Between the reception area and the extermination area was the administrative zone, which housed the SS officers' living quarters, the Ukrainian guards' barracks, kitchens, storage rooms, and a staff infirmary. In total, barely 30 German officers and around 100 auxiliary guards were enough to operate the entire machinery of death. The most heavily guarded area was the upper camp, accessible only to Sonderkommando prisoners, gas technicians, and SS supervisors. Here were the gas chambers, burial pits, incineration ditches, and body stores. This area was separated from the rest by a high, dense palisade built of pine branches woven over a wire mesh, which completely impeded visibility from other parts of the camp. One of the most distinctive elements of the design was the Schlauch, or road to heaven, a narrow corridor about 100 meters long and 2 meters wide, flanked by high wooden walls covered with branches and wire. This corridor directly connected the disinfection barracks with the gas chambers. Its narrowness and layout prevented victims from seeing where they were going or from returning once they had begun the journey. Treblinka's first lethal facilities consisted of 3 crudely constructed gas chambers of wood with wallpaper lining them to simulate showers. Each chamber measured approximately 4 meters wide by 8 meters long with a height of 2.5 meters. The initial total capacity was about 900 people per execution cycle. These initial chambers soon proved insufficient to process the volume of deportees arriving daily. In August and September 1942, under the orders of SS Hauptscharführer Lorenz Hackenholt and architect Erwin Lambert, both veterans of the Action T4 program, a new masonry building was constructed, internally divided into 10 independent chambers. The new structure was considerably more robust, with 40-centimeter thick brick walls and reinforced ceilings. The doors incorporated industrial rubber seals, and fake ventilation grills were installed in the ceiling to complete the illusion of showers. This complex dramatically expanded operational capacity, allowing up to 3,000 people to be executed simultaneously in a single 30-minute cycle. The gassing system used at Treblinka was based on captured Soviet diesel engines, typically 12-cylinder V2 models originally designed for T-34 tanks. These engines operated at low compression, generating large volumes of carbon monoxide rather than dioxide, making them particularly lethal in close quarters. The gases were channeled from the engine room through galvanized steel pipes into sealed chambers, where they rapidly accumulated to lethal concentrations. The heat generated by the engines also contributed to accelerating hypoxic asphyxiation, shortening the time required to complete a killing cycle. Although Treblinka's general model was inspired by the Belzec camp, its designers introduced substantial improvements. While Belzec had only 3 gas chambers, Treblinka expanded this capacity to 10 in its new masonry structure. Furthermore, the flow of victims was reorganized to avoid bottlenecks, intermediate waiting areas, wider corridors for the Sonderkommandos, and an internal signaling system were implemented that facilitated continuous movement without interaction between groups. These improvements tripled the processing speed and reduced the margin for human error during each operation. The construction of the new gas chambers and other major facilities was supplied by local suppliers subordinate to the general government's administrative apparatus. Bricks and cement came from factories located in Sokołów-Podlaski and Małkinia, while the armored doors and rubber gaskets used to seal the chambers were shipped from metalworking workshops in Lublin that formerly supplied military hospitals. These companies operated under compulsory requisitions supervised by the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt (WVHA), which was responsible for coordinating the material resources of the camp system. Unlike improvised facilities elsewhere on the Eastern Front, Treblinka was conceived as a permanent structure despite its temporary function. The gas chambers were reinforced with additional concrete in the foundations to withstand extreme thermal cycles and facilitate washing between executions. The roofs were covered with weather-resistant corrugated zinc sheets, and the pipes were checked every 2 weeks by an in-house technical team consisting of 3 German mechanics. This approach ensured that the system operated without interruption during peak activity in the second half of 1942. Unlike Auschwitz, where Zyklon B was used, the murder method at Treblinka employed carbon monoxide produced by internal combustion engines. High-powered Soviet diesel engines, likely obtained from captured tanks, were used. These engines were installed in a room attached to the chamber building, from where the exhaust gases were channeled through metal pipes directly into the interior, causing asphyxiation within minutes. The choice of this method was based on practical criteria. It was economically efficient, the gas was invisible, and it didn't require sophisticated equipment or specialized personnel. The entire process, from entry to death, took between 20 and 30 minutes, depending on the human load and environmental conditions. The system's efficiency is reflected in the processing figures. According to available data, Treblinka operated with an estimated maximum capacity of 12,000 to 15,000 victims per day. The entire cycle from the arrival of the train to the burial or cremation of the bodies was completed in approximately 3 hours, allowing multiple shipments to be processed in a single day. As Operation Reinhard intensified its deportations, especially after the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto began in July 1942, the Treblinka system underwent several technical expansions. The gas chamber building was expanded with a second wing, temporary mass graves up to 100 meters long were constructed, and later improvised crematoria were set up using metal grates made from railroad tracks over open graves. In March 1943, following an inspection by Heinrich Himmler, an order was issued to intensify efforts to eliminate any physical evidence of the extermination through the systematic burning of corpses. This phase represented a significant technical adaptation, with the development of open-air incineration systems capable of processing thousands of bodies daily. The genocidal machinery, transportation, classification, and disposal. The railway network formed the backbone of Treblinka's extermination system. The camp was strategically connected to the Małkinia-Sokołów-Podlaski branch line, which in turn connected to the main urban centers where the Jewish population of the general government was concentrated. This location allowed for direct transport from Warsaw, Radom, Białystok, and other cities, and even from regions as distant as Thessaloniki in Greece. The organization of the transports required precise coordination between the Deutsche Reichsbahn, German railways, and the SS units in charge of deportations. Each operation followed a standardized protocol that began with the concentration of victims at the Umschlagplatz, or embarkation points, usually located on the outskirts of the ghettos. There, in extremely overcrowded conditions, the cattle cars were loaded at a rate of between 60 and 120 people per unit. Trains arrived at Treblinka daily, sometimes as many as 2 or 3 per day during peak periods. The Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto, which lasted from July 22 to September 21, 1942, marked the climax of this process. During that period, at least 254,000 people were transported from Warsaw, according to railway archives and Judenrat, Jewish Council documentation. Each convoy carried an average of between 5,000 and 7,000 people, with peaks of up to 10,000. Travel times varied considerably, as little as 2 hours from Warsaw, but as much as 7 days from Thessaloniki. During these journeys, conditions were inhumane. The sealed wagons lacked water, food, adequate ventilation, or sanitary facilities. Many deportees died during the journey from dehydration, suffocation, or exhaustion. The organization of each convoy required precise synchronization between the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the local Gestapo, and ghetto authorities. In cities such as Warsaw, Białystok, and Lublin, specific departments existed within the railway offices responsible for assigning cars, schedules, and routes to Treblinka. These offices operated with pre-printed forms indicating the number of people to be deported, the estimated weight of the human cargo, the technical stopping points, and the expected transit times. The SS dictated priorities based on the camp's daily capacity, and station masters received coded instructions that avoided any direct reference to extermination. This system made it possible to maintain the appearance of administrative legality while implementing a massive elimination program. The improvised crematoria, constructed from metal rail structures on brick pillars, functioned like large, open-air grills. Combustion required temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius to ensure the efficient reduction of the bodies to fragments and ash. To maintain this temperature, the Sonderkommandos fueled the pyres with dry wood and accelerated the process by adding gasoline and recycled oil from military vehicles. The bodies were arranged in an alternating pattern of human layers and firewood, which optimized the flow of oxygen. Lighting tasks were carried out by pre-trained prisoners who used oil torches or soaked wicks. A lit pyre could burn continuously for 48 to 72 hours, depending on weather conditions and the volume of bodies. Deportations were also a process with direct financial implications. Local Jewish councils were required to cover the resettlement transportation costs, which included car rental, onboard security, and theoretical passenger support. The fare applied followed the scheme for third-class railway travel, although with variations. 50% of the fare was charged for children under 10, and children under 4 were not included. In practice, the bills included surcharges for special services such as armed guards or closed cars, which raised the average cost per person. This charging structure turned the communities themselves into forced financiers of their deportation, in an extreme exercise of administrative cynicism. During peak periods, the camp operated virtually non-stop. The process followed a precise one-way flow: unloading of the convoy, separation and control of the crowd, forced nudity, collection of valuables, transport through the Schlauch to the chambers, gassing, and finally transfer of bodies to pits or crematoriums. This sequence was calculated to keep the railway platform clear for the next convoy in less than 3 hours, thus optimizing the facility's genocidal output. The total figures for the extermination at Treblinka are staggering. Between July 1942 and August 1943, approximately 870,000 people were murdered there, making it the second deadliest extermination center, surpassed only by Auschwitz-Birkenau. The breakdown by origin shows that the largest contingent came from the Warsaw Ghetto, 254,000, followed by Białystok, 60,000, Częstochowa, 40,000, Radom, 33,000, Lublin, 34,000, and other smaller centers, which together contributed nearly 90,000 victims. Some 8,000 Sephardic Jews even arrived from faraway Thessaloniki, Greece. Parallel to the physical extermination process, a system of economic plunder operated on an industrial scale. The property confiscated from the victims was meticulously recorded, classified, and sent to various destinations within the Reich. Valuables such as watches and jewelry were sent to foundries controlled by the Reichsbank. Money and foreign currency were transferred to the financial departments of the SS. Clothing and footwear in good condition were redistributed to the German civilian population or the army. The scale of this systematic looting is difficult to quantify precisely, but later documents recovered at the Odilo Globoknik trial reveal partial figures. More than 2,700 kilograms of dental gold were extracted at Treblinka. Boxes filled with rings, glasses, watches, and jewelry were regularly shipped to Berlin, and the volume of confiscated clothing would have been enough to equip tens of thousands of people. The final disposal of bodies evolved over time. Initially, the bodies were deposited in huge mass graves excavated with heavy machinery. However, problems such as decomposition, odors, and potential groundwater contamination, along with concerns about concealing evidence, led to the implementation of a mass cremation system starting in 1943. The improvised crematoria consisted of grates made from railroad tracks placed on brick pillars. Layers of corpses and wood were placed on these structures, with fuels such as gasoline or oil added to maintain combustion. Each pyre could hold up to 2,000 bodies and burned continuously for 2 or 3 days. The skeletal remains that were not completely consumed were crushed manually with mallets or ground in special machines, and the resulting ashes were scattered over the ground or buried in new graves. Internal force, organization and operation of internal commands. The daily operation of Treblinka II depended primarily on a parallel structure of forced laborers, made up of Jewish prisoners selected directly from the transports arriving at the camp. Unlike conventional concentration camps, which had a stable inmate population, Treblinka operated with rotating teams assigned to specific tasks within the extermination circuit. According to data extracted from the archives of Franz Stangel's trial in Düsseldorf, 1970, and partially preserved German records, an average of between 700 and 1,000 prisoners worked simultaneously in various capacities. This contingent represented only a tiny fraction of the total deportees, as the vast majority were sent directly to the gas chambers. The selection process was entirely pragmatic. During the unloading of the transports, the guards identified young, strong men or individuals with specific technical skills, such as carpenters, shoemakers, tailors, or metalworkers. They also selected people with language skills, which was necessary to facilitate communication with deportees of diverse origins. Once selected, these prisoners entered a compartmentalized system where each group had specific functions and remained physically separated from the others. This segregation served 2 purposes: maintaining operational control and preventing the flow of information about the camp's overall functioning, which hampered potential acts of coordinated resistance. The internal commands were organized into 5 fundamental operational areas, each fulfilling specific functions within the extermination machinery. One of the groups was the Kommandogruppe Bekleidungsamt, in charge of classifying confiscated personal belongings. Between 40 and 60 prisoners were tasked with meticulously sorting clothing, footwear, suitcases, household items, documents, and valuables such as money, jewelry, and watches. This work required remarkable precision and specific knowledge, including identifying foreign currency, categorizing jewelry, and separating clothing according to its type and condition. Another group was the Dental Sonderkommando, which operated in the upper part of the camp. Their task was to extract precious metals, primarily gold and platinum, from the mouths of the corpses. Using rudimentary tools such as pliers, tongs, and chisels, they systematically inspected each mouth for valuable teeth, which were then placed in sealed metal boxes for later shipment to Berlin or Lublin, where they were melted down. The body handling command was the largest and also the one that faced the most extreme conditions. Comprised of between 200 and 300 prisoners, their work began as soon as the SS doctors confirmed the death of all the prisoners inside the gas chambers. They then opened the doors, dragged the bodies outside, and temporarily stacked them according to criteria such as gender, age, and in addition to the operational groups directly involved in the extermination process, the camp had a small number of prisoners assigned to specialized technical duties. Carpenters made tools, transport crates, and minor structural elements for barrack maintenance. Blacksmiths were responsible for repairing fences, hinges, gate mechanisms, and metal structures used in the improvised crematoria. Tailors sewed uniforms for the auxiliary guards, and shoemakers mended reusable footwear collected from the victims. These workers operated in makeshift workshops under constant supervision, and their output was regularly evaluated by SS personnel based on criteria of practical utility. The rotation of the Sonderkommandos followed a carefully scheduled routine. Each group operated for 4 to 6 weeks, after which they were replaced in stages to avoid accumulating knowledge or bonds between prisoners. The executions of the outgoing groups took place in the lazaret sector under administrative or medical pretexts. They were generally informed of a supposed transfer or rest period and led to the pit under armed guard. The selection of the new group took place immediately afterward, choosing young men from the most recent convoys who were physically evaluated during disembarkation by non-commissioned officers with medical or military experience. The barracks for the internal commandos were rectangular wooden structures without thermal insulation. They were divided internally into work groups, and each unit had stacked wooden platforms like bunks without mattresses. The standard dimensions were 25 meters long by 8 meters wide, with a single entrance and a minimal opening for ventilation. There was no electric lighting, and nights were spent in total darkness. Rations consisted of rationed bread and diluted soup, with occasional supplements of animal fat during peak work days. Although slightly better than those of the deportees, these conditions were not sufficient to guarantee the workers' basic health. The tools used by the prisoners were rudimentary but functional. Those in charge of treating the corpses used iron hooks to drag bodies, metal wheelbarrows with wooden wheels, and ordinary shovels to remove earth or ashes. Members of the dental Sonderkommando used pliers and surgical chisels, many of them from recovered medical loot. For crushing bones, solid steel mallets and improvised mortars made from pieces of agricultural machinery were available. These tools were stored in warehouses guarded by guards, and their distribution followed a daily inventory supervised by technical non-commissioned officers. The hierarchical structure within the work system followed a militarized pyramid model with clear lines of command. At the top were the camp commandants, initially Franz Stangl, followed by Kurt Franz. The Ukrainian auxiliary guards constituted the intermediate level of control, responsible for perimeter surveillance, custody during disembarkation, and targeted executions. In certain commands, the SS designated a prisoner as the leader or capo, granting him limited authority over the others, although these capos were frequently replaced to prevent the consolidation of internal power structures. The living conditions of these forced laborers were only marginally better than those of the other deportees. They received slightly larger rations, mainly to maintain their ability to work in the short term, and had separate barracks where they slept, crowded on wooden platforms without adequate mattresses or blankets. Sanitary conditions were virtually non-existent, leading to frequent outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Despite the extreme control measures, a clandestine resistance network gradually emerged within these internal commands. Taking advantage of the relative mobility of certain groups, such as those in charge of sorting or cleaning, some prisoners established rudimentary channels of communication that would prove crucial in planning the August 1943 uprising. Disruption of the system, the uprising of August 2, 1943. As the first half of 1943 progressed, prisoners in Treblinka's internal commands perceived significant changes in the camp's operations. The frequency of transports began to gradually decrease, and SS officers initiated procedures to eliminate physical evidence of the mass extermination. These indications, combined with the experience of similar camps such as Sobibor and Belzec, led to an inescapable conclusion. Treblinka was completing its operational cycle within Operation Reinhard, which would inevitably mean the execution of all forced laborers to eliminate witnesses. Faced with this prospect, a corps of prisoners began secretly planning an uprising. The organizing committee was formed by individuals with technical skills or relevant military experience. Prominent among the leaders were Julian Chorążycki, a doctor who had served in the Polish army, Marceli Galewski, a former military officer, Zelomir Bloch, a Czechoslovak soldier, and Eugeniusz Turowski, a locksmith who would prove instrumental in gaining access to the camp arsenal. Planning the riot faced formidable obstacles. The prisoners operated in isolated groups with restricted movement and under constant surveillance. Any suspicious behavior could result in immediate execution. Despite these limitations, the committee managed to establish a clandestine network that spanned the various work commands, taking particular advantage of the relative mobility of the cleaning and maintenance personnel. The operational plan was developed over weeks of meticulous preparation. Its objectives were clear: access the arsenal to obtain weapons, set fires at strategic points to create confusion, neutralize key guards, and facilitate the mass escape of prisoners into the surrounding forests. This was not a conventional insurrection with hopes of military victory, but a desperate action to allow at least some to survive to testify about the crimes at Treblinka. Technical preparations progressed gradually. Turovsky, using his position in the maintenance workshop, managed to make a duplicate key to the weapons depot from a surreptitiously obtained wax print. Other conspirators, working in the belongings sorting command, systematically diverted small quantities of useful items: knives, scissors, metal tools, and glass bottles. Files, hammers, and other implements potentially usable as improvised weapons were discreetly removed from the machine shops. A crucial element was the gradual accumulation of flammable materials. Small quantities of gasoline and oil, stolen from vehicles and generators, were hidden in containers concealed under the barracks. Rudimentary incendiary devices were made using glass bottles, fuel, and rags, carefully concealing the materials at various points throughout the camp. The date chosen was August 2nd, 1943, a Monday. This choice was not accidental. Mondays typically saw fewer transports arriving, which reduced the presence of guards on the reception platform. Furthermore, on that specific day, several SS officers, following an established custom, would often leave briefly to bathe in the Bug River during the afternoon, temporarily weakening the chain of command. The time set was 4 p.m., by which time the intense heat reduced vigilance and most of the day's work had already been completed. However, an unforeseen incident disrupted the planned sequence. At approximately 5:45 p.m., a Ukrainian guard intercepted a prisoner hiding money in the belongings sorting area. The ensuing interrogation threatened to reveal aspects of the plot, forcing the organizers to move up the start of the uprising. At 5:50 p.m., the emergency signal was given, and a grenade stolen from the arsenal was thrown at the main administrative building. Events unfolded rapidly from that moment on. Between 15:51 and 4:10, simultaneous fires broke out in several parts of the camp. The flames quickly spread to the staff barracks and the registration offices, where documentation on transports and casualties was stored. Groups of prisoners attacked isolated guards using improvised weapons and the few firearms obtained from the arsenal. The watchtowers responded immediately, opening fire indiscriminately on areas where movement was detected. Simultaneously, a group of prisoners managed to partially cut through the camp's rear fence, creating an escape point for hundreds of inmates who desperately ran into the adjacent woods. Others attempted to open the main gates with limited success due to the greater concentration of guards in that area. Between 4:30 and 7, the fire had spread considerably, generating dense smoke that hampered visibility and the coordination of the Nazi response. Alarms sounded continuously, and the SS managed to establish radio communication with external units requesting urgent reinforcements. Mobile patrols were quickly organized around the camp to intercept the fugitives. The SS administration's response was decisive. At least 3 watchtowers equipped with MG-34 machine guns maintained continuous fire on the open areas. Mobile groups composed of SS and Trauniki, armed with Mauser rifles and sniffer dogs, began systematically patrolling the perimeter and nearby forest roads. The regional alert system was activated, mobilizing additional units from nearby camps. For the next few hours, an intense manhunt unfolded in the surrounding forests. Military vehicles with loudspeakers combed the nearby villages, warning the local population against providing aid to the fugitives under penalty of death. The Nazi response was not limited to the recapture of escapees. Within the camp, Kurt Franz ordered the immediate execution of unidentified prisoners or those suspected of complicity, even without concrete evidence. The quantitative assessment of the uprising reveals both its magnitude and its limitations. Of the approximately 840 prisoners present in the camp that day, between 300 and 400 managed to escape during the riot. However, during the immediate escape, Between 100 and 150 were shot down by gunfire from the watchtowers or hit by pursuing patrols. In the following days, between 150 and 200 were recaptured in the woods and summarily executed. Only 60 to 70 people survived until the end of the war, taking refuge with partisan units or hidden by local residents who defied German orders. The material damage to the camp was significant, although it did not destroy its basic operational capacity. The fire consumed part of the clothing storehouse, some administrative offices, and partially damaged the communications system. However, the central extermination facilities, particularly the gas chambers, were not substantially affected. During the uprising, the rebels managed to steal approximately 25 handguns, 5 rifles, and several grenades, according to estimates later presented at Franz Stangel's trial. Although the facilities were not completely destroyed, the uprising's strategic impact was decisive. A few weeks later, the SS High Command in Lublin, assessing the security risks and considering that the camp had fulfilled its primary function, ordered its definitive closure. Subsequent actions included the gradual closure of all facilities between August and October 1943, the execution of the remaining prisoners, and the intensified implementation of Action 1005 aimed at eliminating all physical evidence of the genocide. The human impact of the uprising transcends objective figures. Survivors who managed to evade capture would become crucial witnesses in the post-war period. People such as Samuel Willenberg, Richard Glazar, Jankiel Wiernik, and Abraham Bomba were able to provide detailed testimony about the structure, operation, and scale of the extermination at Treblinka. Their statements would prove crucial in subsequent trials against Franz Stangl, Kurt Franz, and other perpetrators. Action 1005: Elimination of Evidence and Closure of the Camp. When the Treblinka extermination machinery had achieved its primary objective, having eliminated most of the Jewish communities in the general government of Poland, the Nazi authorities faced a new challenge: erasing all physical traces of their crimes. This process, officially known as Action 1005, represented a systematic effort to eliminate material evidence of the genocide, anticipating possible future investigations if Germany lost the war. The conceptualization of Action 1005 came directly from the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, personally authorized the operation in July 1943. The immediate trigger was the discovery by German forces of the Katyn mass graves, where thousands of Polish officers had been executed by the Soviet NKVD. This discovery, which the Germans used extensively for propaganda purposes, raised concerns that a military setback would allow the Allies to uncover similar evidence of Nazi crimes. The technical execution of the plan was initially entrusted to SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, who had gained experience in mass executions as commander of Sonderkommando Wehr A, responsible for the Babi Yar massacre in Ukraine. Blobel developed specific procedures for the exhumation and cremation of corpses, which would be applied at all the extermination sites in the east, including Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. Local implementation at Treblinka was directed by the camp's last commandant, Kurt Franz. Following the August 2, 1943, uprising, which had accelerated the decision to permanently close the extermination camp, Franz received specific orders to eliminate all physical traces of the operation. To carry out this task, a special commando was formed composed of specifically selected Jewish prisoners who would work under strict armed guard, knowing that they would be executed upon completion. The first phase of the operation consisted of the physical destruction of the facilities. The gas chambers, the epicenter of the extermination, were blown up using explosives strategically placed at structural points. According to Franz's later testimony during his trial in Düsseldorf, controlled charges were used to systematically demolish roofs, walls, and foundations. The debris was removed and scattered to make future identification of its original purpose difficult. The dismantling process extended to all camp structures. The barracks, where the victims' belongings were sorted, were completely dismantled. The railway platform, administrative buildings, watchtowers, and perimeter fences were dismantled. Recyclable materials such as wood, metal, electrical cables, and gates were transported to other camps or used in defensive fortifications against the Soviet advance. This methodical dismantling took approximately 3 weeks, carried out by Sonderkommando teams under constant armed supervision. The technical machinery used in the extermination was also removed. The engines used to produce carbon monoxide in the gas chambers, the tools used to handle corpses, and the auxiliary systems were dismantled and transported outside the perimeter. Simultaneously, all internal documentation on transport, victims, and operating procedures was systematically burned in controlled fires. The most gruesome and complex task was the disposal of the human remains of the approximately 870,000 victims. During the first year of operations, most of the bodies had been buried in enormous mass graves up to 100 meters long and 10 meters deep. Beginning in 1943, on Himmler's orders, a cremation process had begun, but hundreds of thousands of buried bodies still needed to be exhumed and burned to eliminate evidence. The methodology employed in this phase was technically sophisticated. Mechanical excavators and cranes brought from Lublin and Małkinia were used to open the mass graves. The bodies, in various states of decomposition, were extracted and temporarily stored. A group of approximately 300 prisoners worked in continuous shifts, day and night, in conditions that SS Unterscharführer Franz Suckel would later describe as indescribable due to the stench and the advanced decomposition. For mass cremation, huge pyres were built using railroad tracks. These tracks were placed on brick pillars about 5 meters high, forming incineration grates. Layers of corpses and wood were placed on these structures, with fuels such as gasoline and recovered oils added to maintain the combustion. Each pyre could hold between 1,500 and 2,000 bodies and burned continuously for 2 or 3 days until the remains were reduced to ash and bone fragments. The process was optimized over time, operating up to 6 pyres simultaneously with an estimated capacity of 12,000 bodies per day. However, cremation did not completely eliminate all remains. Charred bones and other fragments were removed manually and processed by grinding. Mallets, metal rollers, and occasionally specific machines were used to pulverize these remains into tiny fragments. The resulting ashes and bone remains underwent various final treatments. Some were mixed with soil and distributed across the countryside, others were buried in new, deeper trenches, and some was thrown directly into the Bug River. In cases where the quantity was particularly large, truckloads were transported to be scattered in remote forest areas. The goal was to scatter the remains in such a way that it would be impossible to later quantify the total number of victims. Once the cremation process was completed, the site underwent a complete physical redevelopment to eliminate all visual traces of its former function. The surface where the gas chambers and graves were located was leveled with fresh soil brought from adjacent areas. Saplings, primarily firs and poplars, were planted in irregular patterns to simulate natural growth. To reinforce the appearance of agricultural normalcy, rye, lupine, and wildflowers were planted throughout the former camp. As a final camouflage element, a small farmhouse with a wooden hut was built, housing a Ukrainian peasant. Its presence was intended to lend credibility to the official narrative that the site had never housed a killing center, but had always been a conventional agricultural area. This cover-up operation was completed in approximately 6 weeks, ending in October 1943. To a casual observer, or even from the air, the area appeared to be an ordinary rural area with no distinctive features. Topographical features that might have indicated the previous existence of graves or structures were deliberately altered to obscure any telltale signs. The final phase of Action 105 at Treblinka included the elimination of the last witnesses. The prisoners who had worked on the dismantling and cremation were transferred to other camps and subsequently executed. The SS personnel and auxiliary guards were mostly reassigned to the Eastern Front or other concentration camps, thus dispersing those directly involved in the extermination operations. However, despite these meticulous efforts, the cover-up operation did not fully achieve its objective. On July 26, 1944, advanced Red Army units entered the region after liberating the nearby Małkinia railway station. The site of the former camp was inspected by specialized Soviet and Polish commissions, including the Soviet Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of War Crimes and delegates from the Polish Jewish Central Committee. Despite the elaborate Nazi camouflage, investigators found significant evidence. Thousands of bone fragments and human teeth remained scattered throughout the ground, surfacing especially after heavy rains. Numerous partially charred personal belongings were found: buttons, utensils, combs, and dentures. Further exploration revealed the remains of rails and metal structures buried superficially, as well as ash deposits in covered pits. The expert reports concluded that although the gas chambers had indeed been destroyed, the disposition of the remains and the location of the trenches confirmed the systematic extermination process. These physical findings, combined with the testimony of the few survivors of the uprising, made it possible to gradually reconstruct the magnitude and methods of the genocide perpetrated at Treblinka. In the years and decades that followed, several Treblinka staff members faced prosecution for their involvement in the crimes. Paul Blobel, the architect of Action 105, was captured in 1945 and tried in Nuremberg as part of the Einsatzgruppen trial. Sentenced to death in 1948, he was executed on June 7, 1951, at Landsberg prison. Franz Stangl, commander of Treblinka between September 1942 and August 1943, initially managed to escape to Brazil. Located in 1967 by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, he was extradited to Germany and tried in Düsseldorf. On December 22, 1970, he received a life sentence for complicity in the murder of at least 400,000 people. He died of heart failure just 6 months later on June 28, 1971, after giving a series of interviews in which he partially admitted his responsibility. Kurt Franz, the camp's last deputy commandant and direct supervisor of the local Action 105, was tried in the so-called Treblinka trial held in Düsseldorf between 1964 and 1965. Sentenced to life imprisonment for his participation in the murders of at least 300,000 people, he remained imprisoned until 1993, when he was released for health reasons. In addition to these main cases, at least 17 officers and auxiliary guards faced various trials in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union between 1946 and 1980. Today, on the site of Treblinka II, an impressive memorial commemorates the victims. Thousands of upright stones resembling tombstones symbolize the annihilated Jewish communities. In the center, a large, cracked granite structure represents the gas chambers and the irreparable fragmentation of civilization that allowed such atrocities. This memorial not only honors those who perished there, but also stands as a lasting testament to the Nazi efforts to erase their crime from human memory.